Sandakan can be found in the Malaysian state of Sabah on the northeastern coast of Borneo. While not many tourists visit there, the state leaves a lasting impact on Australian and Japanese history. Few people outside of Japan and Australia know about Sandakan's tragic history, partially due to how few survivors there are. The psychological effects to these few Australian prisoners of war are so overwhelming that they find it difficult to talk about their experience. In Japan, the history of Sandakan was buried by Taiwanese officers that worked under Japanese command officers, and other detailed documents of the camp were burned toward the end of World War II. The Japanese misuse of prisoner labor challenged the Geneva Conventions that the Japanese had signed. The debilitating compromise from the Japanese military was to have the prisoners marched to Ranau for fear of retaliation of the Allied forces. On July 7, 1942, 1,500 Australians were captured from Singapore and transported in a Ubi Maru cargo ship to the island of Borneo. These prisoners of war, known as B-Force, were subjected to horrible conditions on the ship. With little food and overcrowded conditions, it took 10 days for the ship to arrive at the edge of Borneo. In that time, some prisoners noticed a lack of guards on the ship and considered trying to overthrow the ship, ultimately deciding that the timing was wrong. Once they arrived, they were informed that the cargo ship was followed by a Japanese submarine the whole time. Upon arriving on July 17, 1942, the prisoners who could walk were faced with a 13-kilometer walk to the Sandakan campsite. Prisoners who could not walk were brought in by truck to the camp. The site itself was the husk of a British experimental farm, used for keeping livestock, fruit, and grain, and built at the start of the Pacific War. Several weeks after arriving, the prisoners were put to work for the camp in the creation of an airfield for the Japanese military. The airfield was designed to have 2 landing strips for large bomber-type planes, and was extended to be 1,400 meters in length. While prisoners of war, as stated in the Geneva Conventions, are allowed to work when imprisoned for a small wage, there were guidelines also against work on operations of war. By making the prisoners work on the airfield, the Japanese military went directly against the Geneva Conventions they had signed in October of 1942, and the Allied powers were determined to show the Japanese just what they had thought about it. In September of 1944, Allied planes began bombing the Sandakan airfield just after its completion. This brought hope to the prisoners, who could see the raiding from the camp. With the first few attacks, the Japanese had the prisoners rebuild and repair the airfield. After continuous bombing on the airfield, on January 10, 1945, they discontinued the rebuilding, and the Sandakan airfield was rendered unusable. With the prisoners no longer performing physical labor, the officers cut down their rations until finally the prisoners were receiving no food at all. This went further against the Geneva Conventions and the section containing required treatment of prisoners of war. The only food for the prisoners was rice that they had personally stashed away. The Japanese were worried that the Allies would invade Borneo and had to make sure that the Australian prisoners would not fall into Allied hands. The officers had to do something fast, to ensure that their prisoner workforce would not be freed. The Japanese ultimately decided upon their drastic solution. If they could not keep their prisoners, then no one would. The prisoners, already weak from going without food, were now forced to walk 260 kilometers to Ranau, where they were told there would be enough food for all of them. The prisoners were split into 8 groups, each scheduled to leave at a different time, so they could arrive for rations at resting spots along the way. The first group left Sandakan on January 29, 1945, and by February 15th, 15 of the 55 men had died, and the vast majority had succumbed to malaria or beriberi. Many of the prisoners also had suffered from tropical ulcers, also known as jungle rot, due to bacteria that worsened considerably because of the march. They also had to worry about dangerous reptiles and insects, such as crocodiles, cobras, and the giant mountain leech. These leeches were a particular issue. Not only were they difficult to remove, but once removed, this also weakened prisoners. Due to a long period of poor nutrition, their blood failed to clot. Prisoners who were already ill had little chance of surviving the march. Those who were exhausted or ill were marched off with a small group of Japanese soldiers and either left for dead or shot. A few prisoners who had managed to survive did so by escaping from Sandakan and hiding with the help of a local. Only 6 men survived this horrific camp and were material witnesses for the camp commander's trial, where he was convicted for the deaths of over 2,300 people and later executed. Today, there are some features on the island of Borneo that pay homage to the men who lost their lives at Sandakan. There is also a spiritual trail that visitors can walk on through dense jungle, reminding them of the trails that the Australian prisoners faced and lost their lives on.